Hey, my name is Beau. I'm a music teacher and musician. On this channel, I talk about ideas that'll help you learn to practice music better, become a better musician and better music teacher. So in this video, I want to talk about why musicians just struggle to learn music theory and learn to read music, but I'm going to focus more on music theory in this video. If you haven't watched the last video on my channel about what is audiation, you should go and watch that first because this is going to make a lot more sense if you've watched that first. If you already know what audiation is, that's great. You can start here. So traditionally, music theory for many music students unfortunately ends up being this kind of extra thing that they do. I mean, maybe if they're studying classical piano, they learn some songs, through music notation. They learn some pop songs by rote. They just kind of memorize the chord changes. And then music theory, it doesn't end up being something that they use that enhances their musicianship. It ends up being something that they feel like they have to study. And that's really unfortunate because music theory can be extremely powerful when you understand it. But the real issue that people have when they're trying to learn music theory is that music theory ends up being almost kind of this mathematical conceptual thing that becomes detached from audiation. And so by audiation, I mean the ability to turn sounds into musical meaning. So I used this example in the last video, but the tones B and C, they don't have musical meaning. I'm talking about pitches right now, tones. They don't have musical meaning unless there's a context. So they need to be in a key in your mind. They need to be in a tonality in your mind. So for example, again, this B and C, they have a different musical meaning in the key of A minor, like I was just improvising in there, or let's say the key of C major. So if I played a C chord now, and so the first thing that goes wrong when people try to learn a music theory concept, like let's say people try to learn, let's use this example here, a B and a C note in the key of C. If you play a C major chord, you get a C major 7. So that's kind of like a music theory thing. You know, it has a label to it. It has a number in it. But a lot of people, right before they learn that, they don't attach an actual musical example to it. So, for example, if I make you hear the key of C, and now I say in the key of C, this is what B and C sounds like when I put it in the context of this chord. That's what a C major 7 chord is, in a very specific voicing. But the process we go through is we first establish context. I'm making you hear C as the center of gravity tonally. Hopefully you can hear how that C note has like a pull to it. And you can also hear we're in the key of C major. We're not in minor. Hopefully you can hear that. And so right off the bat, what you should be in the habit of doing if you are a musician practicing something, and especially if you're a music teacher, whenever you give someone a piece of theoretical information, you need to attach it to an actual musical example. So it really helps people if it's from a song because they're more likely to recognize and memorize something if it's from a song that they've listened to a lot of times. But even if it's just something like this, like a C major 7 chord, or how a B and a C tone sound in the key of C, we need a real musical example. And we always want to go through this process of establish the key and establish the tonality. And there's a few different ways you can do that. You can do this little scale pattern. You can also do it harmonically. You could play like a 1-4-5. And a lot of the times that will get it in someone's ear. But if someone can't sing the resting tone or the tonal center, you know you're not ready to add content into that. You know you're not ready to start teaching them, some kind of advanced harmonic thing. And so we always want to go through that process. Every single musical thing you learn on an instrument, you need to establish context first. And tonally, I'm talking about the key center and the tonality. All this stuff applies for rhythm, but I'm going to focus on the tonal and harmonic side just to kind of keep the conversation funneled here. And so right off the bat, we kind of have connected this to audiation, but now we need to talk about one more thing about music theory itself. So the general music education world, the way they define the word music theory could mean many things. And so, there's no hate here. I'm fine with however people want to. I'm fine with however people want to define things. But in kind of music learning theory or Edwin Gordon's universe of how people learn music, there is actually a distinction between what he calls theoretical understanding and verbal associates, or something like a label. It does get a little more technical than that. People that know about music learning theory, we can split hairs a bit here. But just basically, we have theoretical understanding versus either a verbal associate or a label. And so this is really important to understand here, because the general music population, I think, just clumps all of this together, and that's fine if you understand. But labels are really where it's at. And so this is the key reason that people are kind of screwing up music theory study, if you will, is that they're not labeling sounds. What they're doing is they're learning abstract mathematical and conceptual structures that are not linked to sound. And so, for example, when you learned your first language, whether it was English or Spanish or French or God knows what you speak, what happened was you saw objects with your senses, with your sights and sounds. And these objects got labels. So this got the label of book. I could go on. I have a shoe. I have glasses. I have hair. Person. So we started labeling objects in our environment. Now, what would happen if your parents tried to teach you a word that you had never seen the object that was attached to? So maybe they taught you the word skyscraper, but you'd never seen a skyscraper. So you could memorize that word. You could probably say that word as a kid, but that word skyscraper would not really have much meaning until you had associated it with something. This is what happens with music theory. People will learn crazy things like, well, I can put a flat 9 on the dominant chord and that'll sound really cool. But there's no actual audiated or sound-based example that gets pinned to. Just how when the kid learns the word skyscraper and they can't picture a skyscraper in any form, it's just a set of sounds. That's kind of meaningless vocabulary. And so really the essence of learning vocabulary is comprehending what that vocabulary means. It's not just about memorizing words. It might be useful to learn how a bunch of words are spelled if you're just competing for a spelling bee, but if you actually want to write in in your native language or just any language, you need to know what the words mean. And the same thing goes for music theory. You can't learn music theory concepts unless they are attached to sounds. And so the first thing about music theory concepts is that really what we're talking about is just a set of labels for sounds. And unfortunately, this often is kind of segregated in music education into ear training. And once you, I would say, upgrade or reorient your thinking about how important audiation is, you kind of realize that you've been stuck in some kind of weird music education matrix where the reason many people are excelling with music theory and just kind of benefiting from it and turning into like musical demons and like they're so skilled at what they're doing is because it's always linked with audiation. And really the most powerful way to do this is every time you learn a music theory concept, you have to be able to associate it with the actual musical sounds in context that you're trying to learn. If you don't do that, really what you're doing is you're learning ideas that mean nothing to you. And so there's nothing wrong with that, but we've all kind of met this caricatured individual. Maybe you've been this individual at a certain time where you're learning about all these crazy things, modes, tonalities, dominant chords that are in tritone substitutions. You're learning about all this stuff that sounds impressive, that sounds, complicated music theory wise, but you can't actually do it. You can't go to a jam session and play a tritone sub when you're playing a jazz piece. You can't recognize a tritone sub when you're listening to a jazz standard. You can't recognize a tritone sub when Stravinsky uses one when you're listening to a symphony. And so the inability of being able to improvise or recognize things when you listen to them, those are signs that you did not actually learn to audiate the music theory concept that you're learning. And so that's really the first way that we talk about, that's really the first way that I think about music theory in the sense, it's just labels for things. We're just labeling musical objects. And that term musical objects is a really good way to think about it. So there's all different kinds of musical objects. There's scales, there's melodic patterns, there's rhythmic patterns, there's meters, there's tonalities. there's chord progressions, there's, little tonal patterns. There's all of these different musical objects that we have to become familiar with. We have to be able to recognize. We have to be able to compose with, improvise with. We have to be able to read them on sheet music. And they need names. They need names to help us organize our thinking. Part of the power of the human mind is that we categorize things and give things names. And so there's nothing wrong with labels. Some people go really hard on the extreme that you shouldn't learn music theory. You shouldn't learn the names of anything because that's all just like, man-made invention. You should just play by ear and feel what you're playing. That's fine if you want to do that. I'm not totally sold that's the best way to make like a harmonically advanced musician, which is often a goal of mine, but some people don't have that goal, which is fine. But essentially, we want to give things names because it makes them easier to categorize, it makes them easier to think about, it makes it easier to communicate with other musicians. And so that's kind of the first type of music theory. The second type, which I would say is more in line with the theoretical part of, theoretical understanding or music theory, is about understanding conceptual structures. And so what do I mean by that? I mean, do you understand that when you're playing a C major scale or any major scale, do you understand the ratio of whole steps to half steps? Do you understand how that's distributed on an instrument like a guitar or a violin or just conceptually in general? That would be a piece of conceptual understanding. When you're categorizing chord progressions, how are chords built? Why is it 1, 3, 5, 7? Why do you have a major, like in a major key, why do you have major triad, minor triad, major, major, minor, diminished? That's another pattern. And so that theoretical information on its own will not make you a great improviser. It will not make you a great composer, but it'll give you a more enhanced understanding of the structure harmonically of music, and I think it's very valuable, and it will give you certain ideas for when you're composing. But again, if you don't have the audiation chops to back this up, if you haven't listened to, tidal waves of music, and you haven't spent tons of time, singing and dancing and really being engaged with music at a non-conceptual level, this music theory stuff, this theoretical understanding stuff, it's just going to be a bunch of, psychobabble, essentially. It's just going to be a bunch of stuff that doesn't make you better at playing music. And unfortunately, there really are musicians who they go down this path of like learning a bunch of complicated sounding stuff, like I have major 7 sharp 5 chords, but they can't improvise with that, or they can't hear that in a song. And that is just totally off base. It doesn't make any sense. And so unfortunately, again, in music education, and this is not what happens with every teacher. I'm painting with a really broad brush here just to highlight that there is a problem right now in music education. Not every teacher is like this. Not every student is like this, of course. But there are people that they're learning music theory in a way that it's not enhancing their musicianship. And it's really unfortunate because it turns people off and it becomes disconnected from audiation. So that's kind of like a high-level overview of what's gone wrong with music theory and why people aren't learning to use music theory, and they're composing and they're improvising and even they're listening. In the future, I'll have more in-depth videos about how do you actually learn something like this dependably? How do you teach someone like this so you don't fall into these traps? These traps really, it's a complete doppelganger with learning to read music notation. I'll have a video of that on this channel pretty soon, but the same kind of problems arise when you start talking about reading music notation. Some people, when they look at music notation, they open the piece and they know what it sounds like. Rhythmically, tonally, harmonically. It's like reading a book. It has meaning to them. But other people, it's actually just a set of instructions for which button to push on a keyboard. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's called decoding. But when you can actually notationally audiate, where you look at a piece of music and you hear it in your mind, it becomes way easier to learn pieces and engage with music notation. I don't personally think you can do that with everything unless you are going to practice for an insane amount of time. We need to do some decoding. We look at music notation of a 21st century classical piece. We have to learn how to hear it by playing it. That's fine. But there's a big potential for notational audiation where we actually learn to give meaning to the sounds on a musical page before we even see anything. And, there'll be an upcoming video on this channel about that. If you like these kinds of videos, you have any ideas for other videos, questions, comments, let me know. It's a lot of fun to talk about this stuff. Until next time, have a great day.